The Basement Tenant, a novel, written by L.Z. Sinclaire, narrated by L.Z. Sinclaire. She found him doing laundry at 1 a.m. on a Tuesday. It had been 10 days since the voices started, and Carrie had developed a routine around them the way the body develops a routine around pain. Not accommodating it exactly, but learning its schedule, its rhythms, the specific hours when it was most likely to arrive. She'd stopped taking the Ambien, not because she didn't need sleep, but because she needed to hear. The Ambien wrapped the world in cotton. She wanted glass. She couldn't sleep. She was hungry. She went downstairs in a robe and slippers, hair unwashed, no makeup, looking like what she was, a woman at the end of a long day that had lasted approximately 14 months. The laundry room was in the basement, one of the shared spaces, accessible from both the main house and the tenant's unit. She'd forgotten about this when she signed the lease, or she hadn't forgotten so much as failed to think it through, which was different. Forgetting implied you'd known. Failing to think through implied you'd been too desperate to care. She opened the laundry room door and Elias was there. He was folding a shirt, a white dress shirt, the kind doctors wore under lab coats. He folded it with the careful precision of someone who had learned to take care of his own things early, and the care in his hands, the way his fingers found the seams, the way he pressed the fabric flat, was unexpectedly intimate to watch. He looked up. He wasn't surprised. "Couldn't sleep?" he said. "Apparently neither could you." He smiled. It was the first time she'd seen him smile, and it changed his face entirely. The hollowed-out wariness softened. The dark circles around his eyes became less clinical and more human, and something in the arrangement of his features shifted from guarded to almost warm. It lasted 2 seconds, then the mask reassembled, but she'd seen it. "I'm between shifts, 36 on, 12 off. The schedule makes you nocturnal." "That sounds brutal." "It's residency. Brutality is the curriculum." She leaned against the doorframe. She should go back upstairs. She should maintain the professional distance that Beth had advised and that the custody filing demanded and that every rational bone in her body understood was necessary. She stayed. "I was going to open a bottle of wine," she said. "I shouldn't drink it alone. Doctor's orders." He looked at her for a moment, that assessing gaze, the one that made her feel like a patient being evaluated for symptoms she didn't know she was presenting. Then he set the folded shirt on the dryer. "What kind?" "Sinclaire. I can't actually afford it, but I keep buying it because apparently my coping mechanisms have excellent taste." The smile again, brief, genuine, gone. "Lead the way." They sat on the back porch. It was January in Chicago, which meant it was 22 degrees and the kind of stupid that only made sense if you understood that the porch, a small concrete slab off the kitchen overlooking the postage stamp backyard that was mostly dead grass and a fence that needed painting, was the only neutral territory in the house. Not her space, not his. The cold was an equalizer. She brought the wine, 2 glasses and a blanket she pulled off the couch. He sat on the top step. She sat on the opposite side, the blanket over her knees, the bottle between them like a shared border. "How long were you at the Tribune?" he asked, and the question startled her because she hadn't told him. Or had she, at the showing? She couldn't remember. The details of her old life had become slippery, unreliable, as if the person who'd lived them was a character in a story she'd read a long time ago. 8 years, investigative desk. "What did you investigate?" "City contracts, housing fraud, the gap between what Chicago says and what Chicago does." She took a sip of wine. It was cold, mineral, perfect. I was good at it. Why'd you stop? The question was simple, and the answer was a labyrinth, because Derek's attorney had subpoenaed her notes from a story about aldermanic corruption and used them to argue she was obsessive, because her editor had called her into his office and said gently that maybe she needed a break, because the break became a leave, and the leave became a resignation, and the resignation became a gap on her resume that widened every month until it looked less like a pause and more like a verdict. My marriage ended, she said, which was true and incomplete, which was how she said most things now. Elias nodded. He didn't press. He held his wineglass loosely, his long fingers wrapped around the stem, and looked out at the dark backyard with the expression of a man who understood that some answers were just doors to rooms you didn't enter until you were invited. "What about you?" she said. "Where are you from, originally?" "Englewood." She knew Englewood. Everyone in Chicago knew Englewood, or thought they did. It was the neighborhood the news used as shorthand for violence, the place Northsiders referenced when they wanted to feel grateful for their own zip code. Carrie had written about it twice, both times from the remove of a journalist who drove in and drove out and filed her copy from a coffee shop in Wicker Park. My mother cleaned houses, North Shore mostly, Winnetka, Kenilworth. She'd take the Metra up at 5 in the morning and come back at 8 at night smelling like other people's kitchens. He paused. "Maybe even yours." Carrie laughed and then stopped because she couldn't tell if it was a joke. His face gave nothing away. "I grew up in Winnetka," she said carefully. "I know. It's a small world, or a stratified one. Same thing, depending on where you're standing." She should have felt defensive. She felt something else, the uncomfortable recognition of being seen by someone who had no reason to look at her kindly and was choosing to anyway. Englewood and Lincoln Park are the same city, the way first class and coach are the same plane, same fuselage, same turbulence, different legroom, different meal. I've never thought about it that way. You've never had to. He said it without malice. That was the thing about Elias. His observations landed like surgical instruments, precise and sterile, and the cut was so clean you didn't feel it until later. Carrie took a long sip of wine and sat with the sting of it, the quiet accusation wrapped in the quieter truth that he was right. They were silent for a while. The cold pressed in. A siren somewhere on Fullerton, fading east. The neighbor's motion sensor light clicking on and off as a cat crossed the alley. "My father wasn't around," Elias said. Not abruptly, more like a sentence he'd been assembling for a while and had decided to release. "My mother never talked about him. I know his name. I know he lived on the South Side and had another family, a family he chose." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It made me self-sufficient. There are worse things to become." "Like what?" He looked at her. In the porch light, his eyes were very dark, and the shadows under them looked less like fatigue and more like depth, like the hollows were places he'd gone that she hadn't, like someone who defines themselves entirely through other people, a husband, a neighborhood, a school. It was the most direct thing anyone had said to her since the divorce, and it landed with the force of a mirror held up at an angle she hadn't expected. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, to deflect, to do any of the things she'd been trained to do by 14 months of therapy and legal coaching and the social survival instincts of Lincoln Park. And what came out was nothing. She had no response because there was no response. He was right, and she knew it, and the knowing was both terrible and, in some airless, reckless way, a relief. "You talk about your old life like it happened to someone else," he said. "Maybe it did. Maybe. Or maybe you just got so used to being Mrs. Weaver that you forgot there was a woman before her. She looked at him. He looked back. The space between them on the porch steps was 3 feet, and the distance was both appropriate and excruciating. "Who's the woman before her?" he asked. No one had asked her that. Not her therapist, who asked how she was coping. Not her mother, who asked if she was eating. Not Beth, who asked if she was behaving. No one had asked her to reach back past the marriage and find the person who had existed before Derek Weaver walked into a Tribune newsroom party in 2013 and told her she had the most aggressive eye contact he'd ever seen. And she'd said, "It's not aggressive, it's investigative." And he laughed, and she'd been lost. "She was fearless," Carrie said, and her voice cracked on the word, just slightly, like ice giving way. "She was really fucking fearless." Elias didn't say anything. He didn't touch her. He just sat with her on the porch in the cold, holding his wine, and let the silence be the response, which was exactly right, which was more than anyone had given her in a year. They talked until 3 a.m. 2 hours. She would replay the conversation later in bed, unable to sleep, turning each exchange over like a stone in her hand, looking for the thing she'd missed. In the morning, she came downstairs expecting silence and found him in the kitchen. He hadn't used the interior door. He'd come up through the gangway and in through the back, the route that technically required crossing the shared porch, which was technically not his space, but also not a space she'd ever thought to define. He was standing at the counter in a gray t-shirt, bare feet on the cold tile, making coffee with his own press. A glass French press that he operated with the practiced efficiency of a ritual performed 10,000 times. "You're up," she said. A meaningless sentence, a placeholder for the fact that she was standing in her kitchen in a robe and last night's mascara, facing a man she'd talked to until 3 a.m. about her dead ambitions and her dead marriage, and the daylight made everything they'd said feel simultaneously more real and more dangerous. "I don't sleep well after night shifts," he said. "Circadian disruption. The body doesn't know what it wants." She poured herself coffee from her own pot, the Mr. Coffee she'd had since the marriage, the one Derek had called an appliance for people who don't care about coffee. And they stood in the kitchen together, 4 feet apart, holding their separate mugs, and the silence was not the silence of strangers, but the silence of 2 people who had said too much and were recalibrating. "About last night," she started. "You don't have to explain anything." "I wasn't going to explain. I was going to say thank you." He looked at her over the rim of his mug. The morning light through the kitchen window was ungenerous. It showed the fatigue lines around his eyes, the slight chap of his lower lip, the rawness that the nighttime porch light had softened into something romantic. He looked, in the morning, like what he said he was, a tired resident running on caffeine and whatever private fuel source kept him vertical. "Don't thank me," he said. "I asked questions. You answered them. That's not generosity. That's conversation." "In my world, those are the same thing." He smiled, the brief one, the one she'd cataloged. "Then your world needs better conversations." He washed his mug. He set it on the rack. He went back downstairs. The interior door closed, and Carrie stood in the kitchen holding her terrible Mr. Coffee brew and thought, that is a man who is careful with everything, including the way he leaves the room. And then she thought, that is a dangerous quality to find attractive. She drank her coffee. It was terrible. She didn't pour it out. He told her about medical school, the way the body became a language you could learn, not just the anatomy, but the narrative, the story a body told about the life it had lived. He said residency was an endurance test designed by people who confused exhaustion with rigor. He said he thought about quitting once during his 2nd year, but didn't, because quitting felt like agreeing with everyone who'd expected him to fail. She told him about the Tribune, the investigations that mattered, the ones that actually changed things, the stories that made aldermen sweat and inspectors return calls. She told him about the high of getting a source to trust you, the specific intimacy of someone choosing to tell you the truth because they believed you'd protect it. She said she missed it the way you miss a limb, not the function of it, but the sense of self it gave you. She said she didn't know who she was without it. He said, "You're someone who stays up until 3 a.m. talking to a stranger on a freezing porch because you'd rather be cold and honest than warm and performing." She said that might be the nicest thing anyone said to me since 2022. He said it wasn't nice, it was accurate. And then they were quiet, and the quiet was warm despite the cold, and she thought, this is dangerous. Not because of him, because of her, because she was lonely in the specific way that makes a person a poor judge of intent, and he was telling her exactly what she wanted to hear, and either that meant he was genuine or it meant he was very, very good at what he was doing, and she couldn't tell which, and the not knowing felt less like uncertainty and more like a door opening into a room she'd locked a long time ago. Nothing happened. Everything happened. She went to bed. She didn't sleep. On the other side of Chicago, Detective Ava Ruiz sat in her car outside a brownstone in Bronzeville and rubbed her eyes. The brownstone was a handsome building on a block that had been handsome 30 years ago and was now what real estate agents called transitional, which was a polite way of saying the old people were dying and the developers were circling. 3 stories, limestone, a for sale sign in the front yard, placed by a brokerage Ruiz didn't recognize. The building had belonged to Margaret Osei, 74 years old, Ghanaian immigrant, retired school teacher, owned the brownstone outright, paid off the mortgage in 2011 with 30 years of careful payments and a financial discipline that put most of Ruiz's colleagues to shame. Margaret had lived there alone since her husband died in 2018. No children, a niece and a craw who called every Sunday and who had been the one to report her missing. 8 months, no body, no note, no activity on her bank accounts, her credit cards, her phone. Her mail had piled up until the postal carrier reported it. Her plants had died in the windows. Her car, a 2015 Toyota Camry, beige, sat in the garage untouched. 3 weeks after she vanished, her brownstone was sold. The sale was handled by a law firm Ruiz had never heard of, acting under a power of attorney that Margaret had allegedly signed, though the niece and a cross said Margaret had never mentioned any such document. The buyer was a development LLC registered in Delaware. The sale price was $340,000 for a building the county had assessed at $520,000. Ruiz had seen this before. Not exactly this, not a missing woman, not a power of attorney that smelled like forgery, but the shape of it. The elderly homeowner who lived alone, the property in a neighborhood on the edge of turning, the LLC that appeared from nowhere, bought below market, and sat on the building until the block gentrified enough to flip. Usually, it was just greed, aggressive but legal, predatory lending, deceptive authors, pressure campaigns that targeted people who were too old or too tired or too isolated to fight back. This was different. Margaret Osei hadn't sold. Margaret Osei had vanished, and then her house had sold for her. Ruiz pulled up the LLC's filing. Lakefront Redevelopment Partners, registered agent, a lawyer in the loop. She ran the name through the county recorder's office and found 11 other property acquisitions in Bronzeville and Woodlawn in the last 3 years, all residential, all purchased from elderly owners, all below market. She should go home, It was late. She had a court appearance in the morning and a bottle of Jameson on her kitchen counter that was making a compelling argument for her attention. She pulled up the lawyer's name instead, ran it through the State Bar Association, found his firm, found his client list. And there, nested inside the corporate filings like a name inside a Matryoshka doll, was a name she recognized: Weaver Development Group. She didn't know why it mattered yet. She wrote it down anyway, because Ava Ruiz had been a detective for 14 years, and in 14 years, she'd learned one thing that the academy never taught. The cases that mattered were always the ones where you couldn't explain why you kept looking. She started the car, drove home, didn't open the Jameson, looked at the name again before she fell asleep. Weaver. The end. You have been listening to The Basement Tenant, written by L.V. Sinclaire, narrated by L.V. Sinclaire. Thank you for listening.